Give everyone one more minute and then we will get started. Okay, I was not late just because I was pushing up code from yesterday. What are you talking about? Okay, let's dive on in. Speaking of yesterday, what did we cover? We used fetch. What did we use fetch for, Susan? For the customer front end, for sending data from the database to the front end, and also kind of vice versa, right? So we started doing true full stack of, all right, we've got to get our customer data that they're filling out in the front end up to the back end. The back end has to save that into the database. The database has to be able to pull all that information out and has to be able to dump it in the table. So hopefully we're starting to feel a little bit more of that full stack going on, the whole interaction between, hey, there's some data in the back end, that data is coming in through the fetch method through our back end to the front end. We're displaying that in a table, hopefully bringing in some concepts of React and state, remembering how we can update the state and have our table just automatically be generated for us. We also started working with the form a little bit. We looped over all of those form fields, and then we sent that data back up to the front end. And then also some concepts of general cleanup, right? Okay, what happens when that form submits? Oh, we want the form to clear, or we have to make sure we update the table with that new form data, or whatever it may be. Kyle, you're completely right. We also did a little bit about requiring fields, and then also the general concept of form validation, right? Of, hey, we want to make sure that this is right before we allow the user to save some more information into the database. Latonia, you had a question about for versus HTML4. I can touch on that. There was also a request in the feedback form last night to cover refs again. I know I kind of threw that in last minute, so I will recover what we did last night for refs and just have another minute to talk through that as well. I'm adding things to my list because we've got a lot to cover today. So just make sure I don't forget anything. Yeah, we can cover the loop versus the long way. So one thing to note is, as a developer, you are going to get things thrown at you all the time, and you are going to be working on a project and be super deep in that and working on it, and your boss is going to go, there's a bug, it's breaking production, we need this fixed right away, drop what you're doing. And before you drop what you're doing, you always want to take a note and be like, all right, here's where I was at. Just something to yourself, because you know you're going to come back to it eventually. Doesn't matter if you do it as an inline comment. Doesn't matter if you've got a whiteboard and you can jot things down on the whiteboard. Whatever you do at the end of every work day, and whenever you're switching to another task, you always want to leave yourself a note. Because the computer is going to know exactly where you left off, and that doesn't help you at all, right? You have to be able to understand where you left off and what you were working on. And also for the sense of accomplishment, having that list and being able to cross things off, super important. So I use a spiral bound notebook because I get things thrown at me left and right. And sometimes they are drop everything tasks where I literally have to stop what I'm working on. Other times it is I need to get to this within the next couple days. So I always kind of try and schedule my Fridays to not accomplish anything and just clean up my notebook, right? Figure out, oh, this is a task that's going to take me a couple days. I'm going to project plan that into next week. Or, oh, this is something I started working on, I want to finish it this week. So when I take my weekend off, which is so important to take time off, when I come back to that next week, I'm going to have a nice bow on it, or I'm going to have things wrapped up and not forget about it if I come back in on Monday. So super important to find an organization system that works for you. I got a ton of crap from all my developers for not using a digital notebook software like Google Drive or Docs, or Notion is a very popular one that's been gaining a lot of market share. That's Notion.so. And they're kind of cool because it's like Google Docs on steroids. It's like a database meets Google Sheets meets notebook. So I've used them. I think they're great. But when I have ideas that just feel like I don't have enough memory to shove them in my head, there is something about jotting them down on a notebook that helps me a lot more than if I type out that list. Don't know why, but it's a system that works for me. So important to find those systems. You'll find that when you do get into a job, some of those jobs will have, most of them should have project management tools set up for you that you'll have to learn. Jira is the big one, Jira. And Jira is used it's the big market leader. Trello is pretty popular, especially among smaller teams. Monday.com is another project management tool, and Basecamp, lots of different ones out there. But you'll find the right hybrid between tools your team uses and you have to learn and you have to use. And hey, that's great, I'm tracking everything in that, but I also need my own kind of brain dump space. Like I can't keep it all in my head. So how am I going to stay on top of all of that? That for me is a good old pen and paper and just jotting things down. Okay. Any questions from last night other than the HTML4, the loop, and the use ref? Anything else that you want me to touch on from last night?
I guess you could touch. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Kyle. It's fine.
I guess you could touch on my question from Slack about the thing that I noticed in Slack about the order that it tabs through. I don't know. I guess I found something called tab index that I'm not sure if that's good to use or not. It said it had I couldn't quite figure it out because it said you shouldn't use one above 0 because it's not compatible for accessibility. But I think you would need to do that in order to make it tab through in the correct order. But it was recommending that you change the order of the form. And I didn't know if you were really doing this as a project, if that's something that would be a problem if you had this layout that you were already given, or if that's something that should have been thought about more in the mock-up stage. Or
yeah, no, it's a good point. I will loop back to that after break because I want to look something up. The way I would approach it is differently. I would actually be listening for the tab key event, and then based off of what was getting tabbed, I would make the other one active. However, that may be overcomplicating it because tab index is somewhere in the back of my mind as a helpful thing. And so tab index is probably the cleaner solution if it is an option. And if it isn't an option, we can explore getting the tab to work through the key code on key press down that I would take. So tab index.
Max, you said you would be listening for it to be in one thing, and then you would make it do the opposite. Is that what you said?
I would basically set it up so whenever our key was pressed, I would check to see if the key was the tab key. And then if it was the tab key, I would figure out what input was active. So like what thing is getting the tab key pressed on. And based off of that, I would find the next field that I would want to make active and make it active. If that makes sense at all. And if not, we may take that approach after I look up tab index after the break. Cool. Any other questions? Sure, go ahead.
Thanks. So yesterday in the form, we did validation. Also, we did required. So required we did with individual fields. Validations, we did in a function or something. So is there a way to do the validation and functions, validation and required in a function kind of together, like where you have a zip code that length greater, less than 5 and empty, so it should be required, something like that. And also, is it a good practice to do them together?
Yeah, so great question, and something that I'm going to kind of hijack your question or piggyback onto your question there. So yes, totally possible to do in the function on the form submit. We were already doing some form validation. There is nothing saying we can't do the validation right in that function and say, hey, check to see if the length is 0 or if it's equal to an empty string. And if it is, throw it back to the user and say, just like we did for the length, say, hey, this is missing or it's empty. The nice thing about the required when we do it in the HTML instead of doing it inside of the function is that we get a much nicer message, right? It kind of highlighted the form field for us and it said, hey, this is required. As opposed to a pop-up where they have to read the message. Now they're getting a nice little contextual thing that says, hey, this is a required field. With that said, we can't always rely on the browser to make those required tags work. In older browsers, I'm talking back to Internet Explorer, the required tag was not built into the HTML standard. And so theoretically, the front end could let that form submit, even though you let it be required. That is when you would want to use the function as well to make sure that the required tag was being respected. You could check the dot length or check for an empty string. And if it was, throw it back. Data validation, however, shouldn't always be done exclusively on the front end. Because remember, our back end is exposed, right? Yes, the user, 99% of users are going to go in and they're going to submit the form, and that's how they're going to get data into the database. However, there's nothing preventing that user from going into the network tab, seeing what our endpoint is, seeing what data is getting sent, and then going over to Postman and using Postman to send a request through. So at that point, we go, well, crap. We had all of this validation set up on our front end to make sure our data in our database and our backend was correct. And they just bypassed it by figuring out what API call we were making, going to Postman and making that API call themselves. So if it is data that you really need to make sure is pristine and making sure that, hey, we shouldn't allow any phone numbers that are less than 10 digits into our database, you should do form validation at 2 levels, both in the front end, either in as a required tag or in the function before we make the API call, but also in the back end. Because remember, our back end is more secure, right? The end user can't just say, oh, let me go to localhost 3001 and see the backend code. There's no real easy way for them to see what is in server.js, what is happening, and editing it there, as opposed to the front end where they can see all of that code and make any changes to it. So if the data validation is very important, if we want to make sure nothing's sneaking in, we also want to do database validation on the .post request in the back end, and then send some error to the front end that says, hey, I don't know how you slipped through this on the front end, but we're not accepting this data because it was not validated. So there are some validation libraries that you can use that make it a little easier. So you don't have to, do .length equals, or there are some easier ways of marking fields as required. The one that's coming to the top of my mind is called YUP, Y-U-P, and it is a package built all around data validation. So definitely an option to use one of those. Also, nothing wrong with going old school and checking length and making sure it's not empty and all of that kind of stuff. The other kinds of data validation that we would normally do are things like length. Okay, well, there's a limit of 255 characters on the database on most of our varchar fields, but we're not enforcing that in the front end. So if they type in some really, really long address and hit submit, the database is just going to truncate it for us. So if we had more time, we would start getting into that data validation, not only on the front end, but also on the back end to say, hey, all that validation that you're doing on the front end, you still want to do there, because if it's one less request we need to send to the server. We don't need to go, hey, server, here's this data. The server processes the requirements, then goes, hey, this data is no good. Now it's got to send it back to the front end. It is better to take a two-step approach of let's validate this all on the front end and hope that the user gets an error message before they even have to make an API call to our server. But at the same time, we can't trust that all of that validation is happening on the front end. So we also have to do that validation on the back end. And so I will do a quick little example of how we would do that validation on the back end, just so you can see the flow of that data. Any other questions?
Yeah, when we did the length of the phone number, we put in 10 digits, and I just realized that that's the actual numbers, not including the dashes. How does it know to not count the dashes?
Good question. It doesn't. I kind of cheated around that and made it so the dashes wouldn't show up. We can do a little example on number formatting and adjusting the length. Any other questions? Guys are pushing a day's worth of content into 2 or 3, which is great. Less stuff I've got to prep for tomorrow. Anything else? You're going to get a little bit of max on the fly tonight. So things don't go as smoothly. It's just going to be real dev work and not pre-prep stuff, which is completely fine. I think good experience for you guys.
Well, you're always polished, Max. So I don't know if you practice in the mirror or what, but can I just toss in, because I like to see comparisons. Can you show us how we would make it know that those are just all digits? Because I know a lot of times when you go in to different platforms, they'll tell, like, if you put in the dashes, it won't take it. So I'm just curious, can we see both ways?
Yep. We're going to approach it the way I would approach it. And then Latonia, if you have any other questions about a different approach, when we go over it, feel free to throw it out then. Because there are lots of different ways of doing it, but we'll approach that. You can use regex for validation for sure, Shaw. It is much easier to not use a regex. It's REGEX, by the way, for regular expression, REGULAR expression. It is definitely possible to do that for things like zip code. That would be a very common approach of, okay, how do we handle it if there are dashes in the zip code? How do we make sure that there are only numbers in this form field? Definitely something that you can do over regex, but you do want to be careful because there are times that you will write a regular expression to validate someone's email address. And you go, all right, what's it take to be a valid email address? Well, it's got to have like their username and an @ sign and then their domain and then dot and their extension. Well, a lot of people thought, oh, back in the good old days of the internet, there were only like 8 extensions, right? .com, .net, .org, all of those. And so a lot of regular expressions were written to just support those domain name extensions. And oh, what happened? Those domain name extensions started to grow. And now all of a sudden they weren't validating. Or someone would have an email address like .co.uk. And the forms weren't validating anymore because the regular expressions were expecting 1 dot at the end of the email. Okay, well, now what happens when they put a dot in their username, which became very popular because Gmail started supporting it. All right, well, now that regex doesn't validate. So you do want to be careful with regular expressions because they are super powerful. And I am a huge fan of them, but they can get really complicated really quick. So you want to be careful about using them. And if you are using them, make sure if they are something as complicated as an email address, that you're using one that's widely supported as opposed to trying to validate it on your own. And Kyle, yes, for sure. A lot of form fields will break it up that way, of having the area code, the exchange, and the number being 3 separate things. Sometimes that's just out of laziness of, okay, we don't want to parse apart this. We just want the user to figure that out. But that is definitely an approach that you can take. And kind of why we split up first name and last name, right? Because there are times we want to keep something separate. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so the list of questions that I have so far is we are going to cover refs again. We are going to go over HTML4 versus regular 4. We're going to go over the loop that we did versus pulling out the form values independently. We're going to figure out tab index and make it so when we hit tab, it moves to the form field that we want it to. We are going to talk a little bit about validation on the back end versus validation on the front end and how we can make sure that things are actually valid. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about the number formatting with the phone number and how we can get those dashes in there. On top of all of that stuff, the list that I have for us for the next couple days are, we need to dive into pagination a little bit, or pagination. I've heard it both ways. I don't know which one is correct. GIF, GIF, take your pick. Either way, you're not going to offend me, even though that GIF is the right way. Opinionated, developer, yeah, you guys got it. So we're going to do a little bit of pagination. We want to talk about search, and we're going to approach search both on the front end and the back end and talk about the benefits of doing it on both. We need to cover middleware a little bit in Express. How do we get some code that's going to help us out on our functions themselves? And do a very insecure auth example as well. So we're going to talk about how do we get our login working. Once we get our login working, what steps are next, and what else do we need to secure? We want to, hopefully I can get to making the service order working and talk a little bit about how we can pull our customer information into our service order information and make sure we're storing that data relationally properly in the back end. And then finally, I will get to this at some point, I will revisit the table scroll and make it so if there are multiple rows, we will be able to get that to scroll properly. The pagination is largely going to solve for that. but it bugged me that I couldn't figure that out off the fly. So at some point I will come back and revisit all of that. Again, tonight, you do not have to code along. All of these features will not be required for the homework assignment for this weekend. What I think I'm going to do is come up with a list of like 20 different things that we covered this week, 20 plus different things we've covered this week, and say, hey, here are the required ones, right? You have to make it so you can save a customer into the database. But then there will be a list of about 10 of them where it's like, pick 2 or 3 of these to do. Okay, maybe get the validation working, maybe do the validation on the front end or the back end, but you don't have to do it on both. So it will kind of be a choose your own adventure this week for the homework assignment. If you're feeling ambitious, if you want to do them all, I'm not going to stop you. But there's a lot going on. I will slow down and take breaks after every topic. All of these topics hopefully are like no more than 15-20 minute topics each. So I will pace and put breaks in between them. So if you want to follow along, I will try and slow down. If I'm going too fast, yell at me though. I will have the polls going, but definitely provide me feedback on that. I know there were some internet issues in Spectrum. There was an outage in Rome. I think there was an outage in the Syracuse area as well. So apologies if you guys do not have internet or having issues. We are recorded on YouTube. So if power does drop out for you guys, it's no big deal. And if everyone suddenly disappears all at once, we will cancel class and just, pick up tomorrow. But if there are huge power outages where I realize I'm talking to myself all of a sudden, I will know what happened. Okay, lots of different topics. I don't think there is any benefit in terms of ordering things, although I will say that I start every morning going through my to-do list and making sure it's in the right order. There are things that always pop up in the middle of the day. There are things that get thrown in. So I try and start my morning with just ordering things out in either a logical order or in an order of this one's easy, this one is hard, this one is easy, this one is hard, and try and shove in kind of hard tasks with some easier tasks, because nothing is worse than saving the hard task until the end of the day. And then it's 4:30 and you're just like, I don't want to do this. Please don't make me do this. Why did I save this one for last? Well, because it was the hardest one. It was the one you didn't want to do. So you do want to be careful with your tasks and shuffling in easier ones with hard ones. Okay, any other questions? Okay. I'm going to start with covering the refs just because. Okay, so I am going to hopefully get my bar out of here. If you do need to pull from yesterday, I have updated the Git repo. It is in module 7, week 3, day 1. And all of the code that I'm starting with is there. I did remove the ref code. So we had a clean slate to start with tonight. Okay. Again, module 7, week 3, day 1, and I'm going to be working in both the back end and the front end today. So what I am going to do is I want to get my server started first. So I'm going to npm start on my front end and npm start on, nope, I need to be in my backend folder. I'm going to cd into my appliance backend, and then I'm going to npx nodemon server.js. I'm going to get my lovely front end up here, and if I just hit the login button, I'm going to come in and I'm good to go. Okay, so I'm going to start with our table scroll. Actually, in my front end, I'm going to pull up my inspect just so we force scroll. And what we had it doing last night was when we were scrolled down here and hit this add customer, we had it scroll back up to the top of this table. The problem is that if we use document.getElement by ID, what we would use in the vanilla JavaScript, we would be bypassing the virtual DOM. Remember, the virtual DOM is what React uses to keep track of everything. And that is how it makes it literally react to your data faster in the state, is that it is controlling everything instead of just dumping it on the browser. And then when you do document.getElement by ID, it has to rely on the browser to go through all of that data again, find what you're looking for, and give you access to that in the JavaScript. So the way we take advantage of the virtual DOM is we use a ref, and the ref stands for reference. And it is basically React's way of hooking in to a div or something in the HTML and giving you access to it down the road. So in order to do that, what we do is we go into VS Code, and it is a hook. So just like use state and use effect are hooks, we also want to say use ref and import that in. So from there, I am going to come down here and I'm going to set up my ref. So my ref is going to say table, and that is going to use ref, and we start out the ref as null because we will attach that ref in 1 second. So we're just kind of creating a placeholder up here and saying, hey, there is a ref that's coming in, and we want to call that ref table. So now we need to attach our ref to the table. So I'm going to scroll down to my table, and down here, I'm going to pass a special prop called ref, and I am going to attach my table to that ref. Save that. And then I'm going to come up, and because my ref up here is global to the customer's component or the customer's function, which renders out as a component, I can use this table wherever I want. So when I come down to add customer, we do all this stuff. We set our customers back in, but what we want to do is scroll up to the top of the table. So what we're going to do is we're going to say table dot. Now, refs are kind of weird. Refs, when they attach, they give you access to the ref when it attaches into the table, right? When we say ref equals whatever. But there is another way we can use refs, and that is to get the current value of the ref out of the DOM. So we're basically, instead of saying, hey, use the ref either when you attach the ref, or we can use the ref at the current moment, whatever the current value is in the DOM, that's what we want to target. Again, DOM, document object model. And the DOM is our bridge, right, between our JavaScript and our HTML. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, use the current placement of the table, right, which is part of the ref under the hood with React. And then because I have it, I can scroll into view. And now this is our vanilla JavaScript. Scroll into view is just something that's built into later versions of JavaScript. And just to reinforce, we can actually go to can I use and do a search for scroll into view. And there is a scroll into view that shows you that it is supported on 98% of browsers. So pretty safe thing to use. But you'll notice Internet Explorer only has partial support for it. So they'll actually scroll it into view, but they won't have that smooth scroll effect. So when you hit the button, it kind of slowly scrolls you up instead of just dropping you in there. What is really cool about Can I Use, though, is while I was searching for scroll into view, I learned about scroll into view if needed. I actually didn't know this existed. And you can see 93% global support is not great, right? There are, even though it is only, what, roughly 6%, that that still is pretty big, and it's not supported on Internet Explorer at all. So sometimes if you're working on an old project, oh, it doesn't look like it's supported on Firefox either, which is a major red flag for me. So we aren't going to use this if needed, but basically what that would do is if it were already in view, it wouldn't scroll it. So good information. I'm going to come back over here. I am going to save and come back over here. And now I'm going to fill out my info. Going to scroll down to the bottom, and when I hit add customer, it scrolls me back up to the top of the table. Okay, as promised, I'm going to take a break and let you guys follow along. Launch my poll. And the use ref code we actually covered last night. So it should be in the student pasted code channel.
Max, is there anything else we needed to do than what you just covered for the use ref?
Nope, that's pretty much it. It's kind of a 4-step process. We import the ref up at the top. We create our ref using the use ref hook, which is step 2. Step 3, we attach the ref to the actual HTML element that we want to reference down the road. And then finally, we use the ref wherever. In this case, we use table.current and scroll it into view.
I must have screwed something up. The server fetches all the data fine, and I did Beekeeper and Postman to add stuff, but when I'm trying to add customers now, it's crashing on me.
What is your error at crash?
In the console, it says error connection refused, uncaught, in promise type error failed to fetch. So it's not posting, right? That would be the.
Is your backend server running?
It crashes whenever I try to post anything.
Okay, so that would probably be an issue with your backend code, not your front end code.
But it was working to post things before I changed the front end. That's the thing. I was posting fine.
If you want
But
to
maybe I did
share
something.
both your customers.js file and your server.js file, I can take a look
Okay.
there.
Thank you.
My gut is telling me it's an issue with the name of the form fields. And that
Okay.
there's an ID on our HTML that does not match the columns in our customer.js model. But that's just my gut. I can't say for sure that it's that.
Well, it might very well be that because I misspelled something when we did the initial creation on the server side. when we set up the table, I misspelled something. So I've tried to consistently misspell it for everything.
And so a reminder for that, if you do update your models, you can always use the db.sync and then in there pass in an object that says force:_true. And what that will do is it will delete all the data in the tables, but at least it will update your table structure to reflect your current models instead of what got created the first time.
Okay, I'll have to work on that later. I'll send the files though. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, when you do your force true, save it, let the server restart, update your models, and then remember to take that force true out because it is very, very easy to save it and forget that you have force true in there, and it's just constantly wiping your database every time you restart the server. So it is a powerful one, a good one, but you do want to be careful about that. You can also run an alter table SQL command and fix it yourself in Beekeeper Studio by renaming the column with just a regular alter table SQL. And then make sure to update it in your model file as well if you do fix it over in the SQL. All right, I've got 5 votes in. Would like to see 1 or 2 more before I roll on to the next subject. 6 votes in, just need 1 more. And we will keep going.
Is there a character limit on the student pasted code?
There might be. If you can send it as 2 separate messages, that may work.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I've got 8 votes in, so I'm gonna keep trucking. The first thing I want to dive into is our for. So we use our HTML4 on our label. And initially, when we copied and pasted this code from Bootstrap, we got an error or a warning in the console. So if I put 4 in here, everything's fine here. But when I switch to my front end, I see invalid DOM property 4. Did you mean HTML4? This is actually a side effect of React being a hybrid of both HTML and JavaScript. When we think about for in programming, the first thing that comes to my mind is a for loop. And so what happened is React got a little careful and it said for, well, do you mean for loop or do you mean for as in some HTML property? And so what they did is they said, we're going to play it safe and we're going to call it HTML for instead. And then under the scenes, when React is taking care of rendering the virtual DOM, we'll make it actually say for in the right spot. The same thing went for class. Class is actually a reserved word in JavaScript, and React did not want any crossed wires. So that's why whenever we use class equals in React, we actually use class name equals. So similar reasons for our HTML4 and our class name, just that they are keywords in JavaScript, and React wanted to be careful and not reuse those keywords in the HTML. I think back in the day, it caused more headaches than people thought. And so that's why we use HTML4 instead of just the regular for, only in React. Normally in regular HTML code, that would be enough. Okay, that is our HTML4 versus the regular for. Let's also cover, while we're in here, our for loop. So initially, I was going old school, and I said, okay, what's the event target? Our event target is our form. What are all of the different inputs in our form? And our input had a first name and a last name and an address. But when we're looking in here, we're going, wait, all of these are properties on our event target. So what happens if we try and just loop over our event target and pull out each individual form field? Well, our form field has 2 different things in it. It's got our dot value, right? What was actually typed into them. And it also has our ID, whatever HTML attribute or property we put on them. So we can actually get clever, and instead of storing all of these in individual variables, why don't we just create an object called form data? And the key of that object is going to be whatever our ID is from the form field. And the value is in the object is also going to be the value coming from our HTML object. And so it is totally fine to do it this way and make our form data by hand by listing out all of those form fields. But this is just a quicker way of looping over all of them. The only thing that we had to do is add our if statement in here where we basically said, hey, make sure there is an ID on all of the inputs, because there is one input, our button, that didn't have an ID on it, and we didn't really want to pull that in. So that's why we kind of just skip it and we say, if there is a form ID, throw it in the object. If there isn't, just skip on and move on to the next form field here. So I'm actually going to comment this out because we don't want to leave console logs in for our final version of the code. But sometimes it's helpful to leave it in there for debugging. Latonia, any questions on that? I'm starting to call you guys out just to make sure I'm answering questions that you guys have posed. Perfect. And when I call you guys out, if you guys have additional questions or want to piggyback on someone else's question, feel free to jump in and ask. We definitely are going for understanding, not just for sheer number of features here. So if there is a single line of code where you're like, I don't know what he was smoking when he wrote that, how did he get there? Feel free to jump in and call me out on it, and I will gladly explain it. And it's not just syntax or, you know, if you're like, I don't get that thought process, feel free to jump in and I'll find a way to either recover it or rephrase the thought process of why we approached it that way. Because we are covering obviously a lot of stuff here. So we want to make sure that it's all sinking in.
You were saying yesterday, I think that the better way to do that was with use state. So you would just make like use state, I mean, like, you know, zip code, set zip code, phone number, set, like for each of those you would make.
Yeah, good question. Let's change our, let's just do our zip code. So we would do const zip code, and then our set zip code is equal to use state. And we want to start that out as an empty string because React doesn't like null form values. They prefer an empty string. And then we would jump down to our zip code form. And in our zip code, come on, where are you? We would say our value of our zip code is going to come from our state zip code. And then when the zip code changes, it's going to give us an event. And our event needs to set the zip code to our event.target.value. And then in our for loop, we would need to come in here, and at the end of the for loop, we would just say form data dot zip code is equal to our zip code from state. And that, in theory, if I refresh, get rid of that error, that in theory should work exactly the same way, except now that data is stored in our zip code in the state. So I'll leave that in there just as an example. We could use state on every form field, and that's a very common thing to do. The other kind of hybrid approach that you could do is you could have one thing in state called form data that was an object, and then update that object over and over again. Joey actually did that in one of the homework examples. He said set, he used his use state hook, and he just called it form data and set form data. The downside to that is whenever you change one of the keys in the form data, it's going to re-render the whole form because it's updating the entire object. So you do want to be careful if you've got like 100 form fields on the page of what you're keeping in state and what you're updating in that state. So there are pros and cons to using what we call the controlled input. And that's essentially what we did down here. We made the input controlled because we added both the value and the on change. So we're basically saying we want React to control what the value of that form input is, compared to another input that we use up here, like a normal input. That is considered an uncontrolled input because we're not hooking into the on change event, and we're not telling React, hey, store this value explicitly. We're kind of relying on the DOM and the virtual DOM to pull those values out in an uncontrolled component, on an uncontrolled form input, I mean. Guess technically it's a component, but yeah. Okay. Any questions on that? Let's do our number formatting next for our phone number. Does anyone want me to stop? Does anyone want a breather, catch up? This is more show and tell for me than it is, hey, you have to do this for your assignment. Okay, so for our number formatting, I'm gonna go find my phone number field. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I am going to say on blur, grab my event and console.log focus lost. So that may not make a ton of sense, but when I type in a phone number and just click somewhere else, you see where it says focus lost? That means that I was in this, the focus right now on the page where the cursor is in my phone number. And when I click to another one, I lost the focus, or the equivalent in React is that focus got blurred. I think it's a terrible name. I don't think it's React that came up with that name. I think it dates back to HTML. But the event that it is called when you lose the focus is called that blur event. So what we can do is we can come in here and we can say, hey, instead of saying focus lost, instead give me the value of that event target value. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to type in 545, I click away, and now I've got access to this. So what we can do is use that to our advantage and say, hey, if the event target value dot length is equal to 10, meaning the user typed it in without dashes or spaces, then set the event.target.value equal to, and now we get fancy with our substrings. So I'm going to just say, instead of saying event.target.value over and over again, I'm going to say const num is equal to event.target.num value. And then I am going to say, hey, grab num substring 0 through 3 and put parentheses around it, then a space, and then put in our num dot substring 4 through, I think it's 3 through 6. This is going to fail spectacularly on me, but no guts, no glory. And then we are going to say dash and then our num dot substring from 7 on. See what that does. So 1, 2, 3 doesn't do anything because it's not 10 digits. But if I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0 and click away, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, I was close. I was only 1 index off. That is way better than I thought it was going to go. So if I throw a 6 in there, if you don't include a second parameter in substring, it just assumes that you want from that index to the end of the string. Jahil, global use date is normally called context. You normally would use the context API if you needed state at a global level. Okay, so now if I come back here and do my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, and I click away, now I get this nicely formatted phone number. So you could get fancy and do it on every single key down. So while they're pressing every button, we're like trying to live format it as it's popping in there. But that might be a little ambitious or a little annoying if they're typing really fast or pasting in a number. So I like that on blur event personally myself, but really depends. With that said, we did break something here. If I type all of this in and hit my add customer, oh, maybe not. I thought we were doing validation on our form for our phone number length. Oh, we're only checking if it's less than 10. So because we added in values there, that's not the end of the world. And it did save in the database right as well. So that's how we would add our formatting. There's a part of me that says we want to show formatting on the front end, but not stored in the database that way. Because if we do store it in the database that way, we're storing more characters. We're storing the parentheses and the dashes. That might be a nitpick. That might be getting too much into the weeds of, well, we should kind of remove them when we save it. And then in the table, we should do the same substring again and format the number out. I've seen plenty of databases with dashes in the phone numbers as well. As long as you're being consistent, that's what really matters. And so I would say this is fine to leave as is. Okay, so that is our number formatting on our front end. Do you guys want to take a break and try that on your own? Give me a thumbs up if you would like to try the phone number, and an open mouth if you love to hear me talk and want me to move on to the next subject. Okay, I'm seeing a couple thumbs up. So I will, I'm gonna just paste that on blur event in case you need to reference it. Oop. And save that, and then I will launch the poll in Slack, in Zoom.
And Max, that's a dash that's in there.
Sorry, my mute button was literally running from me. Yes, it is a dash in there. You're talking between the substring 3.6 and the substring 6?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, those are a dash. And what is the name of the type of string that we use to pull all of that off other than substring?
A template literal?
A template literal. And we know it's a template literal because we're using 1 backticks, and then 2, we're using our $ curly braces. And again, it's called a template literal because we're basically providing the template for the string and then allowing the string to evaluate out to our normal string. So the template we're saying is the substring, substring, substring with some dashes and parentheses around it, and then the JavaScript is going to evaluate out using that template to create our string. Super powerful and a huge addition to JavaScript in the past 10 years.
Max, what was the const with the zip code that you added at the top? Was it another use ref?
That was a use state, just to
That
give
was
you an
use state.
example of how to use a controlled component instead of an uncontrolled component. So we did a use state for zip code up at the top, and then we changed our zip code HTML to have both a value and a on change.
Thank you.
And I'm going to actually show you one more helpful thing. I'm going to move my num out here just so we can say num in here. And I am going to num.length. And then on here, I'm actually going to call, my God, we're way indented. Okay, I'm going to call something called .trim on the end of that. And what trim is going to do is take off any white space characters. So if I'm in my front end and I type in space, 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 and then I type in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, space, 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 without the period in it, what the trim is going to do is make a little liar out of me. Didn't save. Like a good developer, I forgot to save. Okay. So now if I click to the end of it, you see how it removed the spaces on either side for us. Sometimes it's really easy to, have a space in here and type something in and not really realize that that space is there in the front in practice. So calling .trim on our front end is definitely a good feature to make sure that spaces don't end up in the database where they shouldn't be. What trim will not do is remove spaces in the middle of the text. It will only remove white space from the front or the end of the string. So that's just a little trick with .trim. Only have 3 votes in on the poll. If I get a couple more in there, I will know we are ready to move on. 6 votes in, waiting for 1 or 2 more, and then we will keep going.
That was the only piece of code you added, right? You didn't import anything or?
The trim.
No, the on blur.
Yeah, we don't have to import anything for that. On blur is built
Yeah.
into HTML.
I don't know. Mine doesn't seem to be working. And then I tried pasting yours in and it wasn't working either. I don't know if I've got it in the wrong spot. It goes inside of the, yeah, it
The-
goes inside of the HTML tag.
Yeah, you want to share your screen?
Sure.
All of that looks right. So what I would do is I would throw a console log at the top of your on blur before even the if statement. I'm sorry, between 210 and 211. So right after that curly brace, yeah, throw a console log in there. And just word test or, yeah, that's good. And don't forget to save.
Sorry, I just couldn't find my unmute.
Fine.
All right, save. And then,
Uh,
why is it
something
not
like-
letting me save?
there
we
you
go.
go.
Doesn't know what I'm clicked on here. All right. So then, can I just, I
Yep.
guess I'll reload to be safe. Oh. Oh, I was doing it in my city because I have it in a different place than yours. Never mind, this should actually work. I can't believe I did that because I went and moved my stuff around. Okay. It's because I moved my stuff in a different order than yours.
So I think we're good to keep going. So I want to touch on that. Can you share your screen one more time, Kyle, with your design showing? So this is the perfect example of fixing things in UI instead of fixing things in code, because this layout makes 10 times more sense. And when you hit the tab key, it's going to move you over to the last name, right? And flowing through all of this design makes a lot more sense, even though as a designer, you think, oh, cluster address together and then cluster the customer information together. It really makes a lot more sense to kind of go through this flow, right? So Kyle, you asked, how would I get the tab key to line up properly? I think the right answer is to do what you did and actually change the layout of it. With that said, there are 2 different approaches, 3 different approaches you could fix all of this. The first thing you could do is, and I'll share my screen. You could rearrange the way we did this, right, is we had our div class row, and our row had a column in it, and this was one column, and this was another column. And then we came down here and we did another row where this was a column and this was another column. There's another way we could approach that. We could actually make this thing one big row and make this a column with first name, last name, phone number in it, and this a column with address to city, state, all of that stuff. So I believe that would also fix it, because all of this is in a column. It is then going to tab down into the next one. So that would be another way to approach it, is instead of doing this as rows with 2 columns, make it one giant row with 2 columns in it, and then start using your things in here. So, right, you're almost like doing a little bit of a pivot table, right? Instead of saying, okay, have 3 rows, instead you're saying have 2 columns. And that would also change the tab order. The third way you could approach it, other than reordering the elements or changing the actual UI, changing the way it shows up, changing the order in the HTML to make it 2 columns and then put everything inside those 2 columns. You can also use a prop called tab index. So if we go to our first name, in our input, we can put a tab index on this of 1. And then if we go down to our last name, we can put a tab index on this of 2. And then our phone number, we would do a tab index of 3. And finally, we'll go to address 1 and say tab index equals 4. Now you guys get the idea. We should go through and finish it off on all of them. But now that we're in here, if I refresh and I hit my tab key, I go down to my last name. And if I hit tab again, I go to the phone. If I hit tab again, I go to address 1. Now, tab index was initially built for this purpose. It was to say, hey, what order of the tabs do you want? The problem is that assistive screen readers will try and read things in the tab index order, and that may not be what you want, because the experience that you're supposed to get on a screen reader is the same experience that you would get as someone who wasn't visually impaired and looking at the screen. So basically what W3C says, the HTML standard says, is it is better to rearrange the content on the screen so the tab order makes sense than it is to use tab index. So it's a fine thing to, if you go, I really want it to look this way, I just want the tabs to change the order, you can use a tab index. That's the third way. I lied. There are 4 ways off the top of my head that we could fix this problem. The fourth is we could use an on key press event and figure out if the tab key is being pressed, figure out where that input is, and then find the next input and call .focus on it so it would move the cursor there. That is such a bad option that I'm not even going to dare to code it out, because in order to pull that off, we now need on key press events on all of our inputs. We then need to figure out what input is getting pushed. We then need refs to all the other inputs. And now we need to track an array of where the next input we want to go is. Terrible, terrible option. But when you said, how could we do that? I went, well, and that was just the first thing that popped into my head, right? But because you said tab index, I'm like, oh yeah, that rings a bell. I feel like that's the more right answer, right? And so when I looked that up, sure enough, that was, tab index was built for this very purpose, was to control the order of your tabs going through it. So I think that's a fine option to use, because accessibility wise, even using a screen reader, we want the elements to read in the same screen order that we would be hitting tab through. So that is a completely fine thing to use in this case. But there is some pushback on tab index because of assistive screen readers and them using tab index in a slightly different way than the way we think about it.
So you can ignore those warnings as long as the order that you tab through is the order that you want.
You would want the screen reader to.
Why would you be changing the tab order if you didn't want it to be in that order in the first place anyway?
Well, I think that's what they're saying, is if you want it to be in a different order in the first place, then you should just rearrange the items on the screen to be in that order. Which takes me all the way back to the option 1, which is rearrange the fields in a way that makes sense, because that's probably the cleanest approach to this. Which is what you did and works perfectly.
I'm just a little confused why it's a problem for screen readers, though, if
They're basically
it's gonna read
saying,
it in the right order if we fix the order of the tabs. So why is that a problem? Like, in what circumstance would it be different tab order than?
yeah, so like if you ask me to read this as a book, right? I'm going to start at the top left and read my way down. And so I'm going to say first name, address 1, last name, address 2, right? And so what they're saying is the screen reader should be exactly the way someone who is not impaired in vision would also read this. And so the screen reader should actually read first name, address 1, last name, address 2 for this particular UI. So they're saying when you change the tab index, it would read it as first name, last name, phone number, address 1, address 2, yada, yada, yada. So they're saying it is better to just change this UI and move around the components so the order that you read it from top left all the way down is going to be the same exact order that if we were looking at this, it would be. So that's what they're basically saying is.
But I think when you look at that, your mind kind of groups the address stuff together because of the way it's formatted. So yeah, I think that we're creating the same experience that a visual person would have visually. So
and in that case, yes, you can ignore the warning. I would say I'm not an accessibility expert, but what is 10 times more important than not screwing with tab index would be having our HTML4 in here and also having it match the ID, because otherwise the screen reader gets to this and it's like, I've got no idea what they're expecting to put in here, or the ID may be something that they don't know how to read out. And so the end user is trying to input this information and they've got no idea what's associated with this input. So that's the big point of the HTML4, is so that the screen reader can associate this label with this input, which is a harder thing than you think to do when you're building something like a screen reader. The other added benefit is when you click on first name, it will actually focus in the form input for you, which is a nice little bonus. If you click on the label, it puts the cursor in there. But accessibility wise, I would say the HTML4 or the 4, if you're not in React, is 10 times more important than not screwing with tab index. But Kyle, I completely agree with you. Of like, in this case, we would want it to change the order of it. And then at that point, I say throw it out the window, right? Like, there are some accessibility rules where it's like, you must put an alt tag on every image. And I'm like, but I don't want this image to be read aloud. Like, it's going to make no sense if this image is read aloud. It's like, put an alt tag on everything. And then I'm like, all right, fine, I'll put an alt tag on it with an empty string, which is actually what they recommend to do if you don't want the screen reader to read anything. I'm like, oh, for God's sake, like, everything does not need an alt tag on it, you know? But at the same time, I respect accessibility. I understand the importance of it. And I also understand that some screen readers, if it doesn't have an alt tag, it's going to try and use the file path to tell the reader what image is showing up. And that is a recipe for failure, right? A recipe for, oh yeah, go get file path AC13.png. You know, it's like, all right, the end user shouldn't be getting that on a screen reader, so put the alt tag in there. So I see both sides of it. But whenever I use an image in React and it yells at me for not having an alt tag, it's like, mother, you know, and you go in and you fix it. Okay, so that takes care of tab index and 4 different ways of skinning that cat. Terrible phrase, but okay. What time are we at? We're at 6:53. Let's dive into validation on the back end, and then we will take a break. Sound good to everyone? Okay. So let me just do a quick look for Yeah, I don't think I'm going to get into that. If you're really interested in form validation, I would encourage you to check out Yup. It is definitely a way to validate your forms much quicker. It's got 2 million weekly downloads, so I've got no problem sharing it. Karen, if you could drop that in the student resources channel in Slack too, that'd be appreciated. I'm not going to dive into it because I don't want to overcomplicate something. But Yup is definitely something you can use to write out validation faster. So what I am going to do is I'm going to go to Postman. And we're actually going to use this in Postman for when we get to our login in our middleware. So, okay. Gonna open. Take your sweet time to open. Cool. Okay. Close out of that. Close out of the release notes. Okay. So I am going to go to my localhost 3001 and I am going to post to my customers. And my customers, this is all of my messages stuff. So I'm totally going to cheat. And I'm going to, in my form submission, I'm going to just grab this JSON stringify form data, throw that out in my console. And now when I fill out my form with ABC 1, 2, 3, hit add customer, just dropped all of this out for me in this convenient way that I can just copy it and post it right in Postman, say ABC 1, 2, 3. And now when I hit send, I get all of my customers back. And if I go into my Beekeeper Studio, oh, what happened to my phone number? Did I type a letter in there? I didn't mean to do that. And pull this over and connect into my appliances and go to my customers table, we can see my ABC 1, 2, 3 is coming in here. So we did our form validation on our zip code, right? We know that the zip code won't save if there are less than 3 digits on it. And so if we type this in 1, 2, 3 and hit add customer, it's going to yell at me about required fields, but it wouldn't let this be submitted. But there's nothing saying I can't go into this network tab and fill all this out. And when I hit add customer, it says that my zip code is too short. So I'm going to say 45, hit add customer and clear out my filter. Why is that not showing up in the network tab? Oh, because I'm searching for other. Okay, so if I scroll all the way down to the bottom here and pop open my request, we can see all of my data coming in, all of my form data, and then you can see that I am sending it via JSON as the content type. And where am I sending it? I am sending it to my localhost 3001 customers. So as an end user, anyone can open up the network tab and see what APIs are being communicated with and what data is getting sent there and back. So I could come over here and say, oh, you don't want to let me enter a 3-digit zip code? I want to enter a 3-digit zip code. So I'm going to go into Postman and edit my zip code and hit send. And my backend goes, yeah, sure, no problem. And lets me store my zip code as 3 digits. So I just bypassed all of my front end validation. My front end isn't going to let me do that. But as an end user, I could go into Postman and send that same request and bypass all of my validation. So it is very common to go to your backend code. And in our customers, what we will do is we will say if rec.body.zipcode.length does not equal 5, then res.send back an error, zip code too short, you front end cheater. but we don't want to leave it there because res.send doesn't actually end our endpoint. We can actually still run this await customer create code, and then it's going to yell at me and it's going to say, I can't res.send again. You already sent the response. So what we need to do is be careful and make sure we put this in an else statement and make sure that doesn't get sent back. What I also want to do is include, I guess it doesn't matter. Okay, so I'm going to save there. I'm going to go back to my Postman. And now when I send it, zip code too short, you front end cheater. And if I add in my zip code and hit send, now it's back to working again. So validation, important to do both on the front end and the back end. The reason you don't do it only on the back end is because the front end can do a lot of those checks for you before the data gets sent up to the server. But you also want to do it on your back end because that's the only source of truth. That's the only way you know a user isn't bypassing your front end and just making a call directly to your database. The not equals, this is just my fancy font package. So it's a exclamation mark and 2 equal signs after it is the not equals. But on my computer, I have it sent up to do a font ligatures, which is basically the notion of combining several characters into one. And that's how I have it show up like that. Yeah, Susan, it auto formatted. I find that code easier to read on the eyes than an exclamation mark and 2 equals. But I went back and forth on disabling that for the sake of the class. So yeah. So I will post this code sample in Slack.
So that's just going to send an error in the console, right?
Correct. Yeah. So if we wanted to, we would have to come back into our front end code and basically say if data.error, alert our data.error, else go ahead and set our customers to whatever data came back. And so move this up.
But that's kind of redundant because we already handled it in the front end, so.
Correct. For zip code in particular, if we did it on a different form field, you still want to handle errors in your front end. It is entirely possible that your fetch is going to fail. So if it does fail, you should handle that and update your front end code. But yes, that is redundant in this particular case. The only time it wouldn't be is there are some browsers that won't respect the required tag, at which point you could lean on your backend validation to make sure that that information is coming in. So I'm going to grab this. I'm going to drop this in here. Going to cross that off the list for validation. And we will take a break and see you guys at 7:20. Sounds good. Welcome back on a dark and stormy evening. I'm Max, your podcast host for the evening. No, I'm just kidding. Give everyone a minute to come back from break and we'll dive back in.
This is your evening host to get you through your life. That was good. I mean, you should maybe have a nighttime show.
Yeah, both of you
Do
guys.
you remember WKRP in Cincinnati? It was on the 70s and the 80s sitcom. Well, they had a nighttime DJ named Venus Flytrap. It wasn't his real name, but he would just soothe everyone with his music.
There's a podcast. I don't know if it's called Sleepy Time or something like that. And it's this guy's voice that is just so monotonous and just so boring. And he just drones on and on about these stories, and they're made to make you fall asleep. But he just goes on and on about these details and meanders around the story. All of us.
Harrison Keeler.
Yeah. Oh, Garrison
He's
Keeler
great.
had a leg up on this guy. This
Oh, he's
guy
great.
knows how to drone you right to sleep.
William F. Buckley.
What's that?
William F. Buckley, if you've ever heard him speak.
I have not. No.
You don't want to, but it will put you to sleep.
All right. So let's dive back in. So one thing Kyle asked me
Oops.
was, hey, I forgot to save.
Shoot.
This table is great, but there's a lot of scrolling going on to get down here and get all the way back up. Wouldn't it be great if our table just had a scroll and we could scroll through the table? Why, yes, it would. So what I initially thought we would do is find our table tag and come in here and just say like, hey, there's a height of let's say 100 on it. And if there's any overflow outside of that, don't show it. So I came over here and it reloaded in and I went, well, that's certainly bigger than 100 pixels. So I came in here and looked through and I looked at my table and the height's in there. And okay, maybe if I throw an important in there, make sure that it's not 100, no more. And that didn't work. And I went, God, I hate tables. God, I hate CSS. All right, there's got to be another way to do this. So I thought, screw it, because I can't be that far off. I'm going to come up to my col 9 and I'll say the whole thing, style, height, 100, right? Because I'm like, maybe I'm using the wrong CSS property. And then I will say overflow, none. Don't show the overflow. So I come over here and I refresh. And that's not working either. Oh, overflow should be hidden. Okay, so when I set my overflow to hidden, now that's working on me. That's kind of what I wanted it to do, right? Scrunch it up. And so I'm like, all right, I know my CSS properties are right here, but when I stick them down on the table, they just decide they don't want to work for me and they show the whole table 100 pixels to hell. So I go, all right, you wanna tango? Let's tango. I'm gonna take this whole table, I'm gonna throw it in a div. I'm gonna take my closing div tag, I'm gonna find the end of my table, I'm gonna throw a closing div on that. And this is essentially going to be, this is essentially going to be a wrapper for my table, right? I'm taking the whole table and wrapping a div around it. And then in my div, that's when I'll do my style tag height 100 overflow hidden. So I come over here. Hey, my table's scrunched down on me, but it's not doing exactly what I want. I don't want it to crop off like that. What I would like to do is say overflow, scroll that baby. So now when it loads, I can scroll through my table the way I want it to. All right, that's great. Maybe 100 is being a little aggressive there. We'll say like 350. Can always play with that depending on your screen size. And now we can scroll our table as expected. So sometimes CSS hates you. Do not ask me why that CSS did not work on the table itself. I'm sure there is perfectly good reason, but I just cannot tell you what it is. So sometimes you just need to put another div in and target that div, and that will work for you. So if you think you're going insane on your CSS, moral of the story, try it on a different div and see if your CSS is working on a different div or element. And if it is, then chances are it's a problem with where you're trying to put it, as opposed to with the CSS itself. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I have caught up on all of your questions from earlier in class. So we are going to shift gears over to pagination, and then we are going to talk a little bit about search and probably call it a day there, give you an opportunity to practice all the different things we covered tonight. Tomorrow, we will talk a little bit about the middleware and auth, unless we're going really fast tonight and I can sneak that in, which I'm not holding my breath on. And then we've got the service order join as well. At that point, I'm going to loop back into our e-commerce site and start looking into different things that the e-commerce site we should probably cover, and find out if there's a way to either cover those same concepts in the appliance case or just shift gears and go back to the e-commerce site. I know there's one more concept I want to cover, the notion of a reusable details page. So how can we create a product page and then reuse that across all of our products? But we can also do that with the service orders. How do we create a service order page that we can reuse across all the different service orders? So I'm going to add that to the list. And then if there are any other concepts that we have covered at all in the past 4.5 weeks that you would like me to either revisit, or things that we didn't get to that you thought we would be doing in the backend or database or full stack modules, feel free to Slack me that, and I'll be sure to incorporate that into the next 2 days. Clearly, you can see that we can go down tangents and add in a bunch of different features, but I want to make sure we're focusing on where you guys need the most practice. And so I can keep on going on this service, this appliance case, right, and come up with different views and do that kind of stuff. But if you're like, reports is really something I wish we got to. That was a cool thing that I thought was in there, and I really want to know how we would generate out a report for all of this. Feel free to send me that feedback either in Slack in a direct message or in the 30-second feedback form, and I will be sure to incorporate that into Wednesday and Thursday's class. The other thing I will toss up for Thursday, just spitballing off the top of my head here, if you would like to make Thursday an open work session for your capstones, of trying to make your capstones a little bit more full stack oriented, if you would like to kind of make that a group session on people sharing their screens and getting feedback on their capstones, I'm happy to devote Thursday to that. But you would have to mention that either in the 30-second feedback form or DM me. But that would basically just be going around showing kind of like a capstone demo day, but me giving you feedback on like maybe getting the backend project set up or thinking about ways we could structure the backend to make your capstone more full stack oriented, or kind of like mini one-on-one sessions, but that would be shared with the whole class. So if you're interested in that, let me know. If we don't get any feedback on that, I will assume you don't want to do that, and I will find more content for Thursday. But if you are interested in that capstone kind of working day on Thursday, let me know and we can shoot for that. Cool. So let me dive into our pagination a little bit. So I'm going to open up Beekeeper Studio, and I'm just going to search here. And I was hoping it was going to tell me how many rows I had in here, but I guess it's not. Okay, no worries. So let's get super aggressive. We want to say we only want 5 customers to show up a page, and then we can click through to a different page. So what we're going to do is we're going to start in our backend, and in our find all, we can say limit to 5 customers. I'm going to save, and I'm going to come back over here, and I'm going to refresh, and now I've got 5 customers. But I don't have my I don't have page numbers showing up, right? And so I'm going to go back to my VS Code, and instead of find all, I'm going to find all and count. I may have just made that up because I don't remember off the top of my head. Nope, I broke something. Sequelize pagination. Find and count all. All right, I was close. Find and count all. So we go back to my front end, take a look here. Customers.map is not a function. So we think, oh, well, the only thing we changed on the back end was that count. So that must be broken. But really what I think is going on is if we go to our front end and go to our fetch, I want to see what the data is coming back from my back end looks like. So I get my error, but if I come up here and I scroll up to my console log, we see my customers is coming in, but now it's including a count and the rows. So the reason why we need this count is we need to figure out how many pages there will be total, right? We can't just get 5 customers back and then be like, oh, we can put a next page on there, but we want to know roughly how many pages are going to be there. So I am going to come in here, and now instead of just setting my data.customers, I want to set it to data.customers.rows. So I'm going to set it into my rows here. And now I've got my 5 customers showing up. Great. Now we want to use that count in there to figure out how many pages of customers are going to show up. So I'm going to actually go to Bootstrap, and something tells me Bootstrap has a component for pagination. Hey, that's kind of nifty. I would like to use that. So I'm going to just grab this whole nav, and I'm going to come down to, let's put it below my table. So I'm just going to dump that in there and then do a quick find and replace any of my class equals with a class name equals. So we'll save, come over here, and we get our previous 1, 2, 3. But we've got this awkward space here. What's happening is our table, we forced it into a height of 350, but that table is smaller than 350 now, so it's forcing some white space in at the bottom. So what we're going to do is we're going to change this to use a min height. I'm sorry, a max height. Oops. You think I would remember a property with my own name in it? Okay, so that fixes that problem. But we are looking here and we've got a count of 16. Well, if we do 16 divided by 5, we're going to have more than 3 pages. So what we need to do is figure out the page count. So in our fetch, what we are going to do is we're going to say, let's play around here a little bit. We'll do a console log. And if I do my data.customers.count, and we know we are putting 5 on every page, right? So let's do a 5, divide by 5, and that is going to give me the number 3.2. But we need to push that up, right? Because the 0.2 is actually going to show up on the 4th page. So we are going to math.floor. Is that what I want? Returns the largest integer less than or equal to the given number. No, I don't want floor. I want seal. Oh, come back here. 0.95 rounds up to 1, 4 goes to 4, but 7.004 goes to 8. If you guys are having some wonderful flashback memories to the beginning of the JavaScript module, I promise you this will be the most of the math we are doing tonight. I promise you. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to divide by 4 and then take the math.seal of that, SCIL. And let's just see where that pops up. And so I'm going to scroll down in my console and I get 4. So that is how many pages I want, because again, our count ended up being 16. And so if we're showing 5 on each page, we actually need 4 pages, even though that 4th page is only going to have 1 item on it. Does that make sense? Is that
Yes.
math that you would prefer not to think about and just roll with? Okay, we'll roll with it.
We're
Max,
gonna
So-
be adding
question.
customers anyway, so it's gonna need to keep. Right?
Yep.
And by doing it this way, will it keep adding the pages?
Yeah.
Or is it something else we have to do?
Nope. We're gonna have to adjust this because it's only 3 showing up, and we need it to
Right.
be 4 showing up. But yes, we're
But-
gonna modify that.
But I mean, if it needs even more pages, like as we add customers, we're gonna tell it, so that will happen dynamically, right?
It will happen dynamically as
So
we add more
there's 10
customers. The
pages,
count
it
will
will-
increase, and the math will still make sense.
Fantastic, thank you.
And we'll see that in practice and play around with it a little bit. Okay. So what I'm going to do is, because we've got some dynamic data coming from the API, where do we need to shove that in React? We got some data coming back, not in an array, some other special thing in React in particular. Into the state. Don't mean to state the obvious here, but we definitely need to use state. So we're going to say total pages, and then we're going to say set total pages equal to use state, and we'll start it out as null. And then down here, we will say, instead of console logging it, we will set the total pages to math.seal. I had an extra parenthesis in there. Okay. Now we need to be smart about generating our pages. So I'm going to come down to here, and in my page navigation, I can probably take out example. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say this whole nav shouldn't show up if the total page count is equal to, if the total page count is equal to null, or the total page count is equal to 1, right? Because we don't need pagination to show up if there are only 5 or less customers. Then we want nothing to show up. Otherwise, get our nav showing up. So I need to go down to the bottom of my nav and add in a curly brace. And it's telling me that total page count is not defined, which I think it's a little liar, because total page count was defined. Total pages. Total pages. It's a better variable name. We'll use it. Mumble grumble. Okay. So now we've got this showing up, but when the data first loads, you'll notice for a split second, it's not in there. So what we're basically saying, if we haven't figured out the page count yet, we probably shouldn't be showing page information in there. Okay, now we've got to get clever on our 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to just deal one of these, and I'm going to say, we're going to use an array called Pagination LIs. LIS. It's in plural list items. Okay, and we now need to generate that. So I'm going to come up to before our return, and I'm going to say, if there is a total pages, then for let I equal 0, one of the few times you'll actually see me using a old school for loop, while I is less than the total pages, I++. And what do we want to do? We want to push into our let pagination LIs equal an empty array. And we are going to pagination LIs dot push my LI in there with our I+1. It's a lot. I'm going to go through that, but I want to see if it's working first. So I'm going to save. I'm going to come over here, and you notice I have my 1, 2, 3, 4. So all 4 pages are showing up. That's good. The buttons aren't doing anything, right? We can click on them and nothing's happening, but it is showing up here. So let's go over that again. All the way up at the top, we figured out when the data comes in to set the total pages to the count, how many customers there are, divided by 5, and then do some mathy thing to deal with if there's any remainder. Then we set that into the state called total pages. Okay, now when we go to figure out what we're going to return, create an empty array called pagination LIs. That's where we're going to store all of these LIs with the A tags in them. Okay, that's an empty array. So what we're going to do is say, if the total pages, if we've got total pages figured out and we know what that number is, then do a for loop. Loop over this and start at I equals 0. This may make more sense if we start at I equals 1 and make this less than or equal to the total number of pages. That's probably a cleaner way of doing it. So we're going to start at the first page, and I is going to increment every single time as long as we are under or equal to the total number of pages. So this loop is going to push in an LI tag for each page number that we are looping over. And what that page number happens to be is I, which is going to drop in as the label. So if I added like a page number I into that, now when we come over here, we see page number 1, page number 2, page number 3. So all we're doing is generating out all of our LI and our A tags, just like we would kind of usually do with a map, but we can't map over it because it's not an array of 4 things. We just have the number 4. And we're like, we know we want 4 things to show up there, but why? And so what we end up doing is generating that array by hand by basically creating our for loop and getting our for loop to run as many times as we have total pages. Carolyn, I need all of this because I need the LI and the A tag to show up. The only dynamic part is the bracket I, which is what is making it show the page number in here.
Right, that's what I meant, but all you need is that bracket I. You don't have to put anything else in the brackets like I+1 or anything because it's doing it for you already.
Yes, because
Okay,
we're
that's-
starting I at 1. And so what I did is I started I at 0 and I added 1 to it. Either way is fine. This approach is probably a little bit cleaner.
Yeah, I like it and I get it. I just, trying to remember. Thank you.
Kyle, I'm thinking about your question. I'm trying to think if null is less than 2. Because if null is less than 2, we could use less than 2. That's a good question. Here, let's do this. Let's say, let's forget to set our total number of pages and then go down to our ternary operator above my form, right? Total pages null. So let's say if total pages is less than 2, don't show it. And refresh. That does work. Apparently null is less than 2. Today I learned. I mean, null, I guess, would be a falsy value. So it would be the equivalent of 0. So that's a completely fine approach. Well, I say that. We should put it back in and make sure it's still working. And if it is, then we can leave that in. Okay, yeah, so that shows up fine. Now it's just yelling at me that I didn't use a key prop. So I'm just going to come back down to my for loop and push in a key is equal to I. Now that should get rid of my error message for me. And I'm going to clear and refresh. Now I'm getting a lovely warning that it does not want me to use an A tag with an empty href. So I'm going to say, screw it. I will use a span tag instead because we're going to end up using an on click. So if I make that a span tag, didn't break anything over here. Let me refresh. And it's still yelling at me. Customers line 163. 163. Oh, because I've got these in here. SPAN, and I'll remove my href and make this a span. And make this a span. Make this warnings be gone. Okay. I'm going to take a break because there's a lot we just did there. And I'm going to let anyone catch up who wants to catch up. And if you say, screw you, keep going, you're going way too fast, you can do that in the poll if I launch it. Code is pasted into Slack as well if you want to reference that. Goal is to just get the pagination showing up. You notice when we click on this, nothing magically happens. That's okay. We'll get to that in a second. And Carolyn, to your point that it's annoying when they don't do it correctly, you're going to see getting all of this to work is a lot more involved than you think it would normally be. So
I respect that. I mean, this whole thing, I knew programming wouldn't be easy, but it is harder than I ever imagined. And I really respect the people that are already getting paid to do it.
if you are going through the code, the 2 major sections we added is right under the table. We added the bootstrap for the page navigation. Right above the return, we used our for loop. And then we also did some things with the data and setting page count into its own state. So I did that in reverse order. So I'll do that in the right order from the top down this time. We set up state to store our total page count. In our fetch, we then updated our fetch to calculate total page count and set it into the state. Right before our return, we generated our array out with all the LIs that we wanted to show up. And then finally, we went into below our table in the return and dropped in our navigation to show up only if there are 2 pages or more that should be in there.
Actually, just to come back to my question about null, is there a reason that you set it to null instead of 0 and use state initially? Is that,
I set it to null just because we haven't figured out that value yet. We could
Right.
set it to 0 as well,
okay,
or even 1 if you wanted to default it to, just assume there's going to be at least 1 page. 0, null, or 1 are all acceptable values to start that use state off at. Normally, when we're loading the data, we make it null just in case we want to have a loading ... message show up. And then we set it equal to the number or the object or whatever once we get that data back from the server. And not to distract you, but I did post a poll in Slack for what you would like to do on Thursday. Just so you guys have a couple options there. I'm also going to figure out what is available for office hours, and then I will post a poll for that too. You guys, 2 more minutes and then we're gonna roll forward with getting our pagination to work and then probably call it a night. So there will be time, hopefully at the end of class, to work on these if you're still a little behind, but we'll give you guys 2 more minutes. Please check out Slack, the CIC Student C2 channel. I have 2 polls posted over there for what you want to do on Thursday, as well as times for office hours. We will keep going at 8:05. So if you need a quick 2-minute break, take advantage now. Keep working on your code if you want, but we will roll forward at 8:05.
Hey, Max.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I lost track of what we did. The newest code, does it end after the unordered list, or is there more after that?
We just have to update the return and make sure the return is referencing that array that we generated.
Okay, and then if the table that we have is empty, is it even going to show? Because you showed us how if it was less than such and such, it's not going to show. So I'm just
Correct. It
Okay.
won't show if it's under 5 rows.
Okay, thank you.
So we set the total pages to null at the top, and then further down, we have that loop that says if total pages, if that's a truthy value, then go through the loop and do the pagination and stuff like that. Mine is just showing as loading, so I'm guessing for some reason it's not, like maybe if there's only one page, is there a problem with that math.seal?
No, check
thing,
your check where you do your set customers. Because in your set customers, instead of just dumping the data in data.customers, that data is now in data.customers.rows, because we're also getting the count back from the front end.
That's what I have. Oh, let me try taking the S out. I think I might have made mine customer instead of customers. Maybe that's what's going on. No, that's not it.
Feel free to share your screen if you're stuck.
Okay, sure.
Okay, so let's start at our back end.
Oh, okay.
So our back end, we changed our find all to a find and count all.
I forgot that part. Okay.
And if all goes well, if you go back to your front end and force a refresh. Yeah.
Thank you. And then I just got to add some more lines to test it. Thank you.
All right, I'm gonna roll forward because I think you guys are all close, or I have zapped you anyway, and whatever else I cover is gonna glaze over eyes. But I do want to finish up this pagination. So we want to get those buttons working, and then hopefully there will be a couple minutes at the end to help. If you do not get this working, this is going to be one of the many optional steps in the homework for this weekend, right? Not expecting you. We rapid fire today. We went through a lot of different concepts, so not the end of the world. We just want to understand for pagination that we want to do that on the back end and then provide an interface for it on the front end, as opposed to sending all of our customer data and then only showing a couple of them on the front end. We want to do that filtering on the back end and tell the database, hey, heads up, just send the customers that we care about. And then once we do that, send it back to the front end. So what we need to do is we need to keep track of what page number we're on. And in order to do that, I need to share my screen. So up here, we are going to say const, and we're going to say current page num and set current page num. And we are going to start the page number out at the number 1, because we normally start on page 1. And then when we come down to our for loop, we are going to say if let's change this to a template literal. And say if the current page num is equal to I, then make my class name active. Otherwise, just leave it blank. So if I save that, now I get a nice little 1 showing up here. Okay, well, let's get our next button working first, and then we can worry about the other functionality. So when I press my next button, I would like to say on click, set current page num to my current page num plus 1. I'm going to save that, and in an effort to test, I'm just going to hit next, and that's moving it along for me. So that's good. While we're here, we can just take this whole thing, dump it on my previous, and subtract 1. So now I can go to my previous, and it's moving over for me. And now let's just finish it up. Let's go back up to my for loop. When we click on one of these, I think I did it on my LI, set my current page num to whatever I is. So now if I come here and I click, it's going to jump me around to exactly what I want. Okay, all of that's cool. None of it's changing my data up in the table. What can I use to say what whenever page num changes, do something? Use effect. You got it, Latonia. So I'm going to come up here and hey, we already have a use effect. So why don't I just throw current page num in there as a dependency and say, hey, whenever current page num changes, go ahead and load this in. So I'm going to make sure if I refresh my page, everything's still working. And now let me just throw a console.log run, spelled right, maybe. Semicolon. So if I clear, my run happened. And now if I hit the next button, you see it logged it out a second time. And if I click a button here, it's also logging that out. Well, isn't that nifty? So now all we need to do is tell our backend, hey, we're on a certain page number, so offset your results based off of what page it's on. So if we're on page 1, offset them by 5. I'm sorry, offset it by 0. If we're on page 2, offset it by 5, because the first 5 are going to be on page 1. So get the next set of them. So what we're going to do is we're going to add in a route parameter here that is our page num. And so we are going to say current page num and drop that in there. Now we are going to jump to our backend code. I'm going to take out this console log run before I forget. Go to our customers, and we are going to throw the page num in as a route parameter. That route parameter is started with a colon, so it knows, hey, that's going to be a route parameter coming in. So what we are going to do is we're going to say const page is equal to parse int our rec.params.pagenum. Right? Because whenever we use route parameters, it's always going to come in as a string. And so we just need to be proactive about that and parse it into a number because we're going to do some math on it. Now we are going to say offset is going to be 5 times our page num minus 1. That may not make sense, but if we think about it, when we're on page 1, we don't want it to be offset by anything. So 1 minus 1 is 0. 0 times 5 is 0, so don't offset it. Okay, now when page num is 2, subtract 2 minus 1, multiply that by 5, and we're going to offset it by the first 5 that are on page 1, so it will move on to page 2. God knows it will be a miracle if this works on the first try. I mean, I'm a very prepared instructor and have practiced all of this code before. All right, we got nothing. Something's not working. So nothing going on in my front end. I just get a loading going on here. Let's come to my back end, and oh boy, lots of errors. Page num is not defined. Oh, page, because we're using the page that we parsed out. Refresh. Data. Page 2. Different data. Next. Still different data. Previous. By God, that's biggest miracle since I don't know when. All right, so we've got our pagination working. Before you attempt any of the code, do you guys have any questions on pagination as a whole or why we did things the way we did? In the 30-second feedback form, feel free to curse me for using math, but this is one of this is probably the most complicated math I've ever had to do in programming, is just around pagination and rounding a number up or down. This is as about as bad as it gets in programming and math. So the good news is if you've made it through this, chances are you won't have to be doing a ton of more math unless you become like a data engineer and start getting into statistics stuff. But for the most part, as a full stack programmer, this is as bad as it gets. So I'm going to stop my screen sharing. Instead of posting into the Slack channel, I'm going to add this all into the GitHub repo just because we changed things in multiple files. So give me 2 minutes to do that. And I'm going to stop covering content from here. If you would like to follow along, you can. If you would like to curse my name, Karen can drop the 30-second feedback form in the chat, and you can fill it out and say, screw math, I can't believe Max made me do that. My one final request for this evening is please vote in both polls in the CIC Student C2 channel. We will pick office hours at the beginning of tomorrow's class. And then what we are going to do on Thursday, if you can vote in that, that will give me a better idea of what to prep tomorrow. I mean, prep that I already did from this weekend and just go through that. All right, let me get this stuff in GitHub and I will let you guys be. Okay, Classroom Repo is up to date. I will stick around for the next 11 minutes to see if you guys have any questions. If you do not, and you have filled out the 30-second feedback form and voted in the Slack polls, you are free to go 10 minutes early.
Hey Max, so I know the other day you helped me out with figuring out the problem about, like, I guess the module not found.
Yep.
I'm still having the issue.
Ted, go ahead and share your screen. So why are we trying to node database.js? We should be trying to run the server, not a file that's pulling in the server. So if you go to server.js, okay, hold on. We've got a major red flag here. Your front end and back end code are in the same folder. And so the back end should be in a separate folder than the front end because there are different NPM packages that we require for both of them. So if you look at the link that I just posted in Slack, you'll see that I've got my front end and back end separated out, and there are different package.json files for both of them. And so you need to separate out your back end code from your front end code because your front end code has React packages and your back end code is intermixing Express packages with your front end code, which you don't want to be doing.
Oh, okay. Well, then that might be it then. So should I just separate it right now?
Yep, go for it.
Okay.
There's a question on the feedback form about pagination. I'm realizing I never defined what pagination was. Pagination is just the nature of taking our data and making it show up across multiple pages, right? So pagination, literally just taking pages and then innating them, basically just moving the data. So instead of our table having, 50 rows at the beginning of it, that's a lot of data to show all at once. So what we want to do is just break that data up across multiple pages worth of data and then be able to, if my backend was running, be able to switch between those pages worth of data. So pagination is just the nature of splitting data up across multiple pages. Yes, I read the feedback form before class is even over. Why do you ask? Friday at 6:30 seems to be taking the lead for office hours, but knowing you guys by tomorrow night's class, it will be tied up. So I will leave that poll open until tomorrow at the beginning of class, and then we'll pick a time that works. One more minute to ask any questions that you have. If you're stuck somewhere and would like to screen share, I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, there is a beverage with my name on it.
Stella. Stella Artois.
Actually, I have Blue Moon downstairs, but
All right,
we'll see.
that'll work. I have some milk waiting for me. Isn't that exciting?
All right, I'm gonna let you guys go. If you have any questions, you can always hit me up in Slack. Otherwise, have an awesome evening. We'll see you tomorrow.
Can you put the code in Slack as well? The most recent?
I put the link to GitHub, and the
Oh, the link
GitHub
to
has all
GitHub.
the code in it.
Okay.